Okay, so we want to make our spaceship, not our plane, but we want to make it feel a bit more active as it's moving up and down. And to do that, basically we're going to make it look like when we're moving down, the ship is kind of banking to the right, or kind of tilting a little bit to the right, and when it's moving up, it's tilting a little bit to the left hand side. So that's why we have these two other sprites down here. And to do this, we're going to use some animation to control how it looks when it's moving. So we're on the player at the moment, so we're going to go to our animation window and create a new animation here. So we're going to go into our animations folder, and we're going to say this first animation is player idle. And for player idle, basically we want to have it be the default player view. So to do that, we're going to drag our project window over to the right here so we can see our project files and our scene view and our animation window all in the same place. And the reason we moved the the project window rather than the animation window is because we actually want to see a lot more of our timeline ahead of us here. So we want to be able to control what we can see in regards to those. So it makes much more sense to keep our animation on the bottom so we can see a lot more of it. So let's find our 3 bits of spaceship. So that's our 3 ship objects here. So the first one is going to be our player idle. So that's basically what it looks like when our player is in the default kind of standard position. So that's fine. We don't need to add any more animation to this because this is just going to be 1 frame constantly. It's not going to change at all. So let's add another animation. So we click on player idle here, and then we go to create a new clip, and we're going to create a clip called player up for our player moving up in the air. And that one is going to be using the 3rd sprite here. So you can see it's darker at the top, so it kind of looks like it's shifting, so it should be moving upwards. So I'm going to click and drag this onto our timeline like that. And then finally we have another clip for player down for our player moving downwards, and that'll use the other image, and we'll just drop that in there like that. Okay, so we have our 3 animations now, but we don't have any way of actually telling our game which animations it should use. And to do that, we need to use the Animator window. So I'm just going to, first of all, click and drag our project back into view down here, turn off our record view so we make sure we're not doing any other weird changes with that. And I'm going to go to window up here and go down here to Animator and open that up. And that'll open in our scene view, and that's fine. We don't need to worry too much about what we can see here. But what we'll see when we open our Animator is those 3 animations that we just created have all been added as blocks here in the Animator. So I'm just going to rearrange these a little bit. I'm just going to put the player idle there, and I'm going to put up above it and down below it. So this Animator view basically controls the logic of how it moves between different animations. And what we're going to say is, we're going to, in our player controller script, tell this Animator, okay, we're going to give it a value for when we move up and down. Say we're going to give it the value 1 when we should be going up, and we're going to give it -1 when we should be going down. And if we tell that information to the animator can then go, okay, when that particular number is at 1, go to the player up animation. When it goes back to 0, we go back to idle, and when it goes to -1, we go to player down. So let's set up the value we're going to use for that, and the value we'll use is, we'll go to parameters here, hit the little plus button, and we're going to use a float value, and the float value we'll just use movement for that. And then what we do is on player idle here, so player idle is marked as orange because it's the default state that we start off in. And it's the default state because if we hold if we hold Alt and then click and move, we can move this window around a bit. And here we have entry. So entry is basically the start of any of the animations. So straight away it goes from entry. You can see we have this arrow that points to player idle. And then what we'll do is, from the idle position, we'll determine, okay, we should change to a different one. So we'll right click on player idle and say make transition. And then we don't hold and click, we just let this arrow kind of move around with us, and then we click on player up here, and now we have this arrow going from player idle to player up. Let's move this over a bit more, and if we click on this arrow, this is called a transition, and we can make changes to this transition and the logic that it uses to go to player up. So what we can do is go to conditions down here and change the condition that we want to say if movement is greater than 0, but specifically we'll say if it's greater than 0.1, then change to being player up. And that's fine, that's exactly what we wanted to do, but there's a couple of other things we wanted to do that'll give us a little bit of an error. We won't set them up just yet, but we'll return to that in a minute because we'll see it in our game itself. So we've set it so that when our speed is greater than 0.1, we go to player up. So let's say if we're at player up, we want to make sure we can go back to player idle animation. So we'll make a transition back to it and say, okay, when our movement speed is less than 0.1, then we'll go back to player idle. And then when we're in player idle again, say we want to start moving down, if our movement speed here is less than minus 0.1, then we'll go to our players moving downwards, and we'll make the transition again back up to our player idle and say, okay, if our movement speed now is greater than minus 0.1. Okay, so those are our kind of basic values for all that set up, but now we need a way to actually tell the animator what the value is when our ship is moving. So let's go into our player controller script, and we're going to need to be able to interact with that animator object. And much like we saw with the jet flame, now when we created the animator, if we go to our project files, it created a player controller here in the animations folder, and it also on the player object, if we scroll down, it created an animator component that was automatically attached to the player. It did the same thing for our jet flame as well. It created an animator for that. But on our player now, it has the animator component, and you can see it has a controller attached to it, which is this player controller, and that's what we're viewing here in the animator window. So we know that we want to make some changes to this animator here, so we have the animator component attached to it. So if we're going to make changes to it, we know that we're going to need to have a reference to the animator. So we're going to have a private animator that we'll just call anim, and if we're going to get a component that's attached to the same object as the script, well, we know that we can do anim equals get component animator. So we're getting the animator component that's attached to our player ship object, and then what we'll do is just tell that animator object what our current movement is. So we can just say we're only really worried about our ship moving up and down, so we'll tell it what the movement is on the y-axis. So we'll just say, okay, on the animator, on the anim, we want to set a float value, and the float value we want to set is, if we go back in here, the movement value that we're using to control the change between these two different animations. So here we'll say, okay, the name of the float we want to set is movement, and again we want to make sure that's spelled the exact same and capitalized the exact same, and the value we want to send into it is whatever input we currently have on the y-axis. So that's the vertical axis, so we could say input.getAxis raw again, or we know that's been applied to our move input.y, so we can just say move input.y like that, and now that's sending the information into our animator so it knows how it's able to move. So we'll just let that save, go back into Unity and let it compile down below. We'll switch back over to our scene view and we'll hit play, and now we should see when we move up, our ship looks like it's turning and moving along with us. It's fine when we're moving backwards and forwards. We don't really need to have any kind of thing because our jet flame is kind of representing that we're moving with some force behind us. But if we're moving up and down now it looks like our ship is kind of active within the world and it's not just a flat object moving around. But you'll notice when we move up, there's a bit of a delay between our ship moving and the animation kind of happening. And that's because of how our transitions are set up in our animator. Like I said, at the time there was a bit of an error that we were doing and overlooking. And what that is we'll go to the first one we made here when we switch from player idle to player up. Basically we have this thing called an exit time, which is how long it takes to move between each animation. So if I hit this little drop down here, at the moment it's okay, well by default it managed to set the exit time as 0, but sometimes it won't do that. But we also have this transition duration of 0.25. So that means it takes 0.25 of a second to transfer between our idle animation and our player up animation. So what we want to do is we want to make sure our transition duration is set at 0, and we also want to turn off exit time because we don't want it to take a certain amount of time to exit. We'll also turn off fixed duration because we don't want it to take a certain amount of time to change between each one. So we'll do the same on all 4 of these different transitions. So we'll turn off exit time, turn off duration, and set duration to 0, just to make sure that we're kind of doubly making sure that we're not going to get any weird things going on. So we just need to make sure we do that with all our animations whenever we make a transition between them. The reason it's set up to do that is because if you're, say, using a 3D character, you want it to kind of smoothly go between different animations, nice and gradually. But because we're using sprite-based animation, we want it to instantly snap between one frame of animation and another. So that's why it's built into Unity that it adds this little bit of duration as we go, but we don't want that, so we need to make sure and disable that as we play through the game. Okay, so now we'll press play, and this time, as soon as I tap up, you instantly get the movement being applied. So now it feels a lot more immediate, a lot more like it's reacting to your input, and we can go ahead and keep playing the game.